Hi, everybody. Welcome to the WonderCon 2021 panel, Stan Lee Goes to College. Stan's 60s and 70s appearances at universities, colleges. I'm Danny Fingeroth. I've written a recent biography of Stan called A Marvelous Life. When Marvel first started hitting it big in the early and mid 60s, it had a large audience of college students who read the Marvel comics with varying degrees of irony, especially in the days before the underground comics really hit their stride. Students in whatever level of consciousness, alteration or not, would read comics and write in and then organize chapters of the Merry Marvel Marching Society. Stan's first college appearance at Bard College in upstate New York. The people who organized that, unfortunately, are no longer with us, but they reported that Stan was flattered to be asked, but really had no idea. He was a little confused why a college would even invite him. But he caught on quickly, especially as college students reached out to him. And his second appearance was at Princeton University. And we have an incredible array of people who dealt with and worked with and welcomed Stan in one way, shape, or form to their college and really made college safe for comics. And we're not going to go in any logical order here, but I'm going to let the gentlemen introduce themselves on the panel. And of course, we have Dr. Travis Langley working the tech. So thank you, Travis, for making us all look halfway decent.
Well, I'm Scott Saternye. I've been into comics pretty much all my life. My first memories of a comic book at age 4. Ran a comic shop for on and off for 15 years. So that's my cred.
I'm Tim Tulenko. The reason I'm here is that I was a sophomore at Princeton in 1964 when our association with Stan started. I was the first president of the Princeton Merry Marvel Marching Society and helped organize the visit that Stan eventually made to Princeton in March of 1966. In later life, I really didn't stick with comics that much. And after the age of the 70s, when the underground stuff started and all, I kind of dropped off on that. My favorite magazine back then actually was the National Lampoon. Anyway, did 3 years in the Army, went to grad school in history, and then did 25 years with the State Department, and I'm now a retired diplomat in Washington, D.C.
Cool. So I just one quick question. You said you were president of the first president of the fan club. Were you elected or appointed of the Triple MS?
Self-organized.
Okay.
Well, I'm Tom Tolenko, and as the catchphrase goes, whatever my brother said. Since we grew up in the same place in Northern Ohio and in the same family, we pretty much read the same magazines. At any rate, yes, we both went to the same college at Princeton. I was also a history major. In later life, started out as a military historian and then switched over most of my career as an analyst in the intelligence community.
Mr. Michael Uslan. Michael, you need no introduction, but if you could give yourself a brief introduction, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'll give you the tagline. This is the one you would put on my poster. Originator and executive producer of the Batman film franchise.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, beyond that, comic book geek since before the age of 4 when I learned to read from comics up until today. That's probably the most accurate description of me.
That sounds pretty accurate, and leaving out about 100 things you've done and are doing and will continue doing. But that will be a whole other panel, symposium unto itself.
But not too many people know I first met Stan when I was 11 years old. It was 1962, and Fantastic Four #9 had just come out. That was the one where the Fantastic Four go bankrupt and they're evicted from their magnificent, wonderful headquarters, the Baxter Building in Midtown, New York. So we had off from school for whatever reason. It was a Tuesday, and me and my friend Bobby convinced my mom to drive us to New York City so we could go on the DC Comics tour that afternoon. They had a tour every Tuesday afternoon. And when at the end of it, they gave out comic books, foreign comic books, autographed pictures of Batman and Superman, and then pages of original artwork. They actually would chop them up in a paper cutter. They give you either a top tier, a middle tier, or a bottom tier of a page, except I was up there so many times and got to be such a pain in the ass that Saul Harrison knew whenever I showed up, he just gave me pages. He just gave me the full pages so I would stop pestering him.
Because they'd never be worth anything.
No, it was junk. So I'm 11 years old. We go on the DC tour and I'm pestering my mom. We want to see the Baxter Building. We read about it in Fantastic Four. We want to see it. We absolutely, totally believe this was a real building in Manhattan. And we're wandering around Midtown. Nobody seems to know where it is. My mom asks a cop. The cop doesn't know where it is. So she goes into a phone booth. I have to explain this to anyone under the age of 30. You know, it was like this little booth you would actually walk into, and there would be a telephone. You would put in a dime and get a call. And they had this big book and the pages were yellow. And you could open it up. So my mom found Marvel Comics. They were at 655 Madison Avenue. And she called up. And she was put online with a woman named Flo Steinberg, who was Stan Lee's secretary and assistant. And my mom said, I'm taking these kids. We're here from New Jersey. We're trying to find the Baxter Building. And Flo, and if you knew Flo, she was the kindest, sweetest person in the world. And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Uslan, but the Baxter Building was created by Stan and Jack, and it doesn't really exist." And my mother said, "Oh my God, these boys are going to be so terribly disappointed. Can I bring them up and take them on the Marvel tour? I just took them on the DC Comics tour." She goes, "Oh, Mrs. Uslan, we are so much smaller than DC Comics. We don't have those kind of tours." And she goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm just looking at them. They are going to be so heartbroken." So of course, Flo then says, "Well, listen, bring them over here and I'll meet with them and I'll see what I can do." So over we go to Marvel, and Flo comes out and she brings me and Bobby back, and we meet Stan, we meet Jack. And I brought with me my oldest Marvel comic, which was All Winners number 18. And they autographed the comic book for me, and I was thrilled. And Stan Lee was absolutely my idol. And that was it for me, circa age 11. So that's where our relationship began. When we spoke when I was in college, of course, he had no knowledge or recollection of meeting me when I was a little kid, of course. To me, it was one of the great events of my life.
You were one of the first people teaching, even when you were an undergrad, you were teaching comics, and Stan got involved in that. So tell us about that.
Yeah, happy to tell you about that, because it was a life-changing experience for me. Seriously, life-changing. It was the early 1970s, as I'll tend to explain, to set this in the context of the times, a time of great experimentation on college campuses. And because there may be children in the audience, I will not say anything further about that. However, as a reflection of those times, Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, which is where I went, I got my 3 degrees there. They started an experimental curriculum department in the College of Arts and Sciences. And the concept was that if you had an idea for a college course that had never been taught before, and in addition had the backing of a department on campus, you then would qualify to appear before a panel of deans and professors, excuse me, to pitch your project. And if they accepted your pitch, you could then teach it for up to 3 hours of credit at Indiana University. And it didn't matter if you were a professor or if you were an undergrad. I was a junior. And I thought, what a great opportunity here, because at that moment in time, nobody in the world had taught a college accredited course on comic books. And I said, let me sit down and do a syllabus, because comic books are a legitimate American art form, as indigenous to this country as jazz. Comic books are literature. I could discuss the psychological impact of comic books on its audience. and of course get into the Wortham era and everything that came along with that. Can talk about the roles of comic books in education. And I realized that to me, comics were contemporary folklore, that our superheroes were our modern day mythology. So I went to the folklore department and I talked to one of my folklore professors, Dr. Henry Glassy. And I talked to him about this. And I gave him my pitch, which included the Greeks called him Hermes, the Romans called him Mercury, I call him the Flash. The Greeks called him Poseidon, the Romans called him Neptune, I call him Aquaman. And Dr. Glassy says, Michael, you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter if we call our superheroes Beowulf or Ulysses or Superman. It doesn't matter if we call them King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table or the Justice League or the Avengers. These are still the same basic folklore stories of brave warriors fighting the demons and dragons of their day. And he said, I'll back you. Folklore department will back you on this. So armed with that and a group of Superman and Batman comic books under my arm, wearing my Spider-Man t-shirt, I entered this dark mahogany room, and there was the dean sitting at a big conference table with the professors around him. He took one look at me and said, so you're the kid who wants to teach a course on funny books at my university? And yeah, I knew that there was trouble ahead. He let me do my pitch, and this was the first pitch I ever did in my career. He let me do it for 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, and then he cut me off. He said, no, Mr. Uslan, I don't buy this. Come on. He says, I read comic books when I was a kid. I read every issue of Superman I could, but all comic books are cheap entertainment for little children, not folklore, not mythology, not art. I reject your theory. And at that moment in time, rather than picking up my funny books and turning around and walking out of the room and figuring I had nothing to lose, I stood my ground. I said, Dean, may I ask you 2 questions? He said, sure. I said, you familiar with the story of Moses? And he looked at me and said, yeah, so? I go, so very briefly, Dean, could you summarize the story of Moses for me? And he said, I don't know what game you're playing here, but I can play this with you. He said, the Hebrew people were being persecuted. Their firstborn were being slain. A Hebrew couple placed their infant son in a little wicker basket and sent him down the river Nile, where he's discovered by an Egyptian family who raised him as their own son. When he grew up and learned of his true heritage, he became a great hero to his people. But I go, stop, that is great. Thank you so much. You mentioned before that you read Superman comics when you were a kid. By any chance, do you remember the origin of Superman? He said, oh, of course, the planet Krypton was blowing up. Scientist and his wife placed their infant son in a little rocket ship and send him to Earth. There he's discovered by the Kents, who raise him as their own son. And then he stops, stares at me, and says, your course is accredited. And with that, I became the first ever college professor of comic books with the first ever college accredited course. Massive publicity went out on this course. It was just like it was like today, something going viral. And this was in the day pre-social media, internet, and computers. So it was pretty incredible.
How did you get all that publicity? Were you the guy behind the publicity, I'm assuming?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my mom said, I was so excited about teaching the course. And my mom said, you know, you've got a real opportunity here, but you have to remember that you can have the greatest creative ideas, the best creative wares in the world, and nobody will know about them if you don't market yourself and if you don't market them. So I said, Mom, I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, for God's sake. I'm in college. I have no money. What am I going to do? How am I going to market myself? And it was like, all right, you're a smart boy. You'll figure it out. So once again, figuring I had absolutely nothing to lose, I picked up the phone and I called United Press International, which back then was as big as the Associated Press. And I asked to speak to a reporter who deals with stories dealing with education in the state. And this gentleman got on the phone and I just started to scream at the guy. And I said, what's wrong with you? You're not doing your job. This is outrageous. You're supposed to be the watchdogs of our society and you're doing nothing. And he said to me, calm down. What are you talking about? And I very indignantly said, what am I talking about? Are you kidding me? I just heard that there's a course on comic books being taught at Indiana University. Are you telling me as a taxpayer in this state that they're using my money now to teach our kids comic books? This is crazy. This has got to be a communist plot to subvert the youth of America. And I slammed down the phone. So it took this reporter 3 days to investigate and find out if IU really did have a course like this. And he tracked me down, and he didn't know I made the call. And the article that he wrote, including pictures, was a third of a page long. And this thing was picked up by virtually every newspaper in North America, a whole bunch in Europe. My telephone started to ring off the hook, and it never stopped. I wound up never teaching one individual class that wasn't filled with television cameras and reporters. First one down was the NBC Nightly News with John Chancellor. I had the one night with Family Weekly, Sunday Supplement, Parade Magazine, Sunday Supplement, Playboy, and Penthouse. Everybody was reacting to this story. I got a call from Ripley's Believe It or Not. I'm in Ripley's Believe It or Not now. I have the cartoon. It's my mother was so proud. And it just kept spiraling and spiraling. So about 2 weeks out, my telephone rings, and it is this exuberant male voice. And he goes, "Hiya, is this Mike Uslan?" I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Hiya, Mike. This is Stan Lee from Marvel Comics in New York City." And as you know, Danny, I refer to this, and I've always referred to it as my burning bush moment, because I was speaking to my God. I couldn't see his face, but I heard his voice, and I was speaking to him. And Stan said to me, "Mike, everywhere I look, I'm seeing you on TV. I'm reading about you in newspapers. What you're doing is really great for the whole comic book industry. How can I help you?" And that moment began a transition for me from Stan Lee from him having been my idol since I was a little kid, to becoming my mentor and friend. And that was an incredible, incredible moment. Stan was a combination of really jammed up at this moment in time and wanting to make sure that on a course like this with college students, that the people who could be speaking at my course could best relate to them and be like of their own age group generally. So Stan offered and sent to my class Jerry Conway and Steve Englehart. And they came out, lectured to my class. We got a lot of publicity off of that as well.
They came out together or separately?
They came out together.
Uh-huh.
They did a dog and pony show, and we arranged for all kinds of press to be there as well. So they were doing interviews as well as doing the class itself. Stan also had Marvel send me any comic books I needed, anything I wanted that could help me in doing this. And that was just an utter game changer for me.
This is what Stan looked like circa 1972. So he, let's see, looked like he had gotten rid of the beard, which he'd had earlier. He kept the mustache. That's Stan in the Marvel offices. We're going to go to Virginia Commonwealth University. Scott, tell us a little bit. Is this anything what it looked like when you were going there?
Heck no.
Oh, this is what it looks like more or less recently. Tell us about Stan visited, and you took a series of photos, which I saw on Facebook, and actually included them in my book because I thought it's a series. I'll show them quickly. You know, it's almost an animation.
1976, I'm in my junior year at Virginia Commonwealth University. A friend of mine comes in to my dorm room, and he's on a panel, that committee that invites people to come and give talks at the university. And he says, Stan Lee is coming. And of course, it was like, aw. He was also a comic book guy, and I think he's pretty much the one who suggested that we bring Stan in. So they arrives. I had been taking a photography class, had my black and white camera with the film loaded up. Stan was coming. I was going to take pictures. He comes in. It was in a large classroom. It was packed, standing room only. I think there was like a podium next to this desk, and didn't have anything to do with it. He just went around to the desk and sat on it and started taking questions. Didn't really have anything prepared. He was freewheeling. He was funny. He was obviously, well, seemed to me at least to be having a good time. And of course, we in the audience just ate up every syllable that came out of his mouth.
So when you say the room was packed, about how many people would in that room?
I'd say there was probably about 50 people in the room.
Uh-huh.
Now, I've never went to any of these talks at the university brought in people. I could not tell you if this was typical or this was high or this was low. This was the only one that I was ever interested in. Virginia Commonwealth University, for those who aren't aware, is in Richmond, Virginia. It's not the biggest city. It's not, it's not Princeton. But he seemed to be enjoying himself. As you can see, one of the pictures has him laughing at something. I don't remember what. There you go.
Was it like an entertainer was coming, or a professor, or was it something totally different?
When I was in college in the mid 70s, there wasn't an organized comic book community. We didn't have people that of like mind that got together and talked over comics and so forth. So there was, you over time. You tended to realize that this guy that you met when you went into his dorm room and had a poster of Dr. Strange up, he's a comics guy.
Right.
There were posters up. Couldn't tell you really how much publicity it was given. Whether or not 50 or so people was pretty much the limit that this talk was going to get at this university, or it just wasn't publicized well enough. I couldn't say. I can't say that I'm disappointed because this was, as you can see, I'm right up next to him there.
Right.
So it was much more intimate in that sense, and probably more enjoyable for those that were there.
You were a kid when the first Marvels came out. Were you continually reading the comics even through college?
Yep, I continued reading comics all throughout my life, pretty much up until this year. And I wanted to be a comic book artist. And that was one of the things I was trying to do at VCU, taking illustration and things like that to try to prop me up somewhat. So in the mid 80s, I opened up a comic book shop in Charlottesville, Virginia, the late lamented Daydream Books, and had that for 11 years. Someone who had a game store wanted to open up, wanted to add comics and hobbies to that, and approached me to manage the comics, and I did that for 4 years, so 15 years comics retailing.
So Stan appearing there was not a nostalgia thing for you. It wasn't like you were remembering something from when you were a kid. You were still actively engaged.
One of my idols was appearing before me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Scott. And by the way, I just want to tell people, I know that these are a little out of focus, and I appreciate Scott letting me use them for the book and show them here. I think they're great photos. I think they really capture a moment in history and in Stan's evolution and in Marvel's evolution. Just in case anybody was wondering what the cover of A Marvelous Life looks like, that is my Stan Lee biography. Inside there are 16 pages of photos, one of which has those 3 photos by Scott. If you've ever wondered about how to edit comic books and the mysteries of comic book editing, I am teaching a workshop at the end of April through the beginning of May at comicsplex.com. It is my pleasure to welcome, as far as I know, for the first time, well, of course, this was Scott's first convention panel appearance that I know of, but Tom and the legendary Tom and Tim, or Tim and Tom Tulenko brothers. You may have seen their names in biographies of Stan or Marvel, but these 2 guys were instrumental in Stan, what seems to be his second ever college speaking engagement. So take it away. I believe Tim is going to be the first to speak, right?
As I mentioned earlier, the real hook for Stan's presentation at Princeton was the invention of the Mary Marvel Marching Society, which a bunch of guys at Princeton instantly bit down on. We had been reading the stuff right along in high school. I was a sophomore at the time. As you mentioned before, Stan actually had made one college presentation before this. It was at Bard College in June of 1964. We eventually He organized his second appearance at Princeton, which is like a year and a half later, in March of '66. And I'm going to tell the part of the story about how we got our hooks into him. Mary Marvel Marching Society, the first of 3 successive Marvel fan clubs, popped in the magazines in November of '64. All the readers got this invitation to sign up for the fan club, and for the price of $1, they would enroll you in the society and send you a bunch of nutty gizmos. This is the ad that explained all of that stuff. The gizmos included a button saying I belong to the MMMS, a goofy membership card, various stickers, I think objectively cheesy, tiny little 33 1/3 record. And near the bottom of the ad, there's the invitation that if there's more than one of you, if you've got at least 5 friends, you can sign up as a local chapter. And so several of us that were reading the stuff back then got together, pooled our $1 bills, and I sat in to become the Princeton chapter of the Mary Marvel Marching Society. That was November 17th. As it says on the coupon, the least you can do is rush all those nutty gizmos real fast to me. In fact, they were still on the way when suddenly Fantastic Four issue number 35 popped on the newsstands. This is the certificate for a local chapter. It's not filled in, but we really got ours back then. So Fantastic Four number 35 pops in November, even though the cover date is February of '65. So this issue, called Calamity on the Campus, is about Reed Richards bringing the whole Fantastic Four with him, going back to his alma mater, Empire State University, to give a lecture. The thing that we instantly noticed, quite a few of us at Princeton, is that the backdrop is a particular building. That building is a real building. This is a close-up of that building. That's the real Blair Hall. You kind of notice a similarity. We certainly did. So we got all spun up about this, and I decided to do something about it, partly because this is actually the building that was the headquarters of the PU Mary Marvel Marching Society. Just out of the picture to the left is the room that Tom and I occupied for a couple of years as president and pursuivant of arms, i.e. the chief herald of the Princeton Mary Marvel Marching Society. I decided to pop up to New York and ask Marvel Comics why they were using that particular building as a faux representation of Reed Richards' State U alma mater. I went up there in December of '64. I just walked into the office suite of magazine management and then Marvel Comics Group and ran into Flo Steinberg. And I asked fabulous Flo, what's our dorm doing as a stand-in on Empire State University? And Flo said, well, I really don't know. Maybe we should ask Stan. This is the old days when you can sort of walk in on Stan. Anyway, Stan overhears us and invites me in. And I show him a copy of the Fantastic Four. I show him a postcard of Blair Tower. I mentioned this is my dorm and ask him what it's doing as a stand-in for State U. And Stan says, I don't know. I just figured Jolly Jack just freehanded it and he just drew it. I never realized it was a real building. We got to talking. He said, well, when you're back there at Princeton, let us know how you like your gizmos from the MMMS and send me some comments on it. I did that very soon in January of '65. Flo, in the meantime, our gizmos had arrived and Flo had down 10 copies of Fantastic Four 35 to distribute among our 10 members at that point. Stan very soon wrote back and said that he had asked Jack what the deal was. And as it says here in his letter back to us, there's no real dramatic explanation. Jack just saw a picture in Life magazine and it looked kind of good. So he just used it for reference. I didn't really know what school it was, because he says that sometimes Jack can be a veritable fount of information. Anyway, he thanked us for all our communications and keeping in touch. Said, you've almost made us feel like Princeton alumni. And he finishes off by saying, hey, the Thing just yelled at me, so where's my honorary degree already?
I'm going to just quickly, I just wanted to point out, it's dated January 25th, '64, but it's really '65.
It's a typo. By November, a year after all of this started, we had truckled Stan into thinking about whether a bunch of us could come up to his office and talk to him about all this stuff. So we got a letter from Dennis O'Neill saying, pick a date on a Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, and just come on up. And a bunch of us went up. Bob Keener, on the left of the photograph, that's Tom next, Clayton Lewis, and then there's me. Notice we're all wearing our MMMS I Belong badges. Stan, like he did with many of the folks he talked to in those days, used us for feedback. And he started out by saying, don't tell me what you like about the magazines, tell me what you don't like. And so everybody piled on with various deep and not so deep analysis, all of it totally tongue in cheek. I mentioned as president that there are factions forming inside the MMS about Spider-Man's social life, whether it's too heavy, too weird, whatever. But Stan was actually a little surprised to hear, however, that several of our dozen or so members at that point had subscriptions to Fantastic Four, Thor, and all of those guys, but not Spider-Man. Stan had a good time getting all this feedback. We had a good time giving it, and we pitched a formal invitation to him, or the idea of coming down to Princeton. He agreed pretty much, and it's the first time he's done it since BART a year and a half ago. So Stan agreed at that point to do a visit. Fairly quickly, we organized a date around January 10th, and that's where I'll pass the story off to my brother Tom.
Moving along. So we had our agreement in principle. We were ready, getting organized down at Princeton for Stan to come down in the winter. And then a letter shows up from Flo, which points out, yes, we had sent him the formal invitation, et cetera, and he's ready to do it. Whereas it turned out it was arranged for Friday, the 11th of March. This is how it all came off. These were two small announcements in the campus newspaper on the day. So people would have seen this on Friday morning, that Stanley is coming down for whatever my brother was characterizing as an informal seminar in Whig Hall. We did minimal arrangements. This is the campus newspaper on Friday, March the 11th. So that would reach everybody at breakfast, and just a couple of small announcements said that Stanley was going to visit at 4 o'clock and gave the location. Now, as we all know, 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon at most colleges, just like at Princeton, nobody's actually doing any work. So this was an astute time to schedule it for. Stan and Joan just drove down after lunch from New York. There was time enough before 4 o'clock to give him a brief campus tour. And of course, that had to include walking past the steps at Blair Hall, just like in FF35, where all the folks are, and this is a modern picture, but where the folks are down there on the lawn just below and down on the steps. That's where Reed and the rest of the FF landed their plane for when he was showing up at Empire State. Also, see the big tree there on the left, the windows in the dorm just to the right of the tree is where our rooms were for 2 or 3 years. This is two Greek Revival buildings, marble-clad, Clio Hall and Whig Hall. These were the original buildings for the Society of Undergraduates that used to invite most of the student invitations for speakers. The university academics took care of themselves. What this is that going back about 200 years before 1966, there were founded the Cliosophic Society and the American Whig Society, which then emerged about a century later. But they are the oldest college political, literary, and debating society in the United States. The two were headquartered, or the merged society is headquartered now in Whig Hall. The university owns Clio. And so that's where the talk was going to be, and hold the talk. So we booked a large room, the James Madison room, with really good wooden armchairs for about 50 people, and the standing room capacity would be about 70. Incidentally, at Princeton at the time, by now, as Tim said, our chapter maybe had 10 people in it, but there were many, many other individuals who had signed up for the MMS, and there were probably a couple of other chapters. So an unknown number of aficionados. So we put the little ads out and just see who shows up. We filled the place, the standing room. So it was somewhere between 50 and 70 people. So it's kind of like what Scott says about VCU. The room's got a fireplace and white painted walls. It's a very Greek revival sort of a place. Joan was the only woman in the room. Why? Because Princeton was all male in those days. Coeducation didn't come to Princeton until 3 years later in 1969. Also, these were simpler days, and everybody was such rookies. Nobody took photos. All the Avengers assembled at 4 p.m. The room was full, and so Tim gives the little welcome to Stan and Joan and introduces Stan, who literally needs no introduction, of course. So Stan does what becomes in the future his ordinary pattern, just like at VCU, that he's not giving a real speech. He tells people he's not going to give a real speech. Talks for about 2 minutes and says, let's just hear what you guys want to know about. And let's remember, except for Bard, he's never done this. So we start out with questions. A lot of people were really big Dr. Strange fans in those days. So they're asking, why doesn't Dr. Strange have his own magazine? And Stan says, well, it's just partly about capacity and logistics. We'd love to give lots of the characters their own magazines, and Dr. Strange would be near the top of the list, but we don't have enough artists and production capacity to make more books right now. Then he mentions also, well, there's a complication too, because the artist, Steve Ditko, has recently announced that he's leaving. This got an adverse reaction by the crowd. And this was before Ditko actually left Marvel in January. This is March, and the magazines that would announce this weren't on the stands yet. So this was like breaking news. About 2012, Scott Howe, one of the other Marvel historians, discovered a tape of the first 20 minutes of the meeting at Princeton, and he parked it on YouTube, and it's fascinating. It's a little bit muddy in spots, but it's worth a listen. So Tim and I were figuring out, in some ways, stand in the talk, probably 45 minutes to 50 minutes, probably handle about 25 questions. We'll say the first 10 of those are actually on the tape. He talks about the Marvel method, some good stuff about Jack Kirby. He points out that as he's at this point, he just received the artwork for the Galactus episodes. That's a great time.
Nobody really had scope in the questions to talk about the artwork, and the revolutionary sort of Kirby revolution about how superhero comics were supposed to be done. That everybody loved it, but there just wasn't really that sort of an occasion in the meeting. But everybody, of course, was really loving it, and they could always write in letters about some particular thing that they saw in a particular mag. At any rate, it was everyone had a good time. Stan was happy. Everyone gave him a standing ovation. Since we were at the American Whig Cliosophic Society, we gave Stan a sheepskin. Namely, we made him an honorary member of the Cliosophic Society and gave him this certificate, except that the one that we gave him was completely filled out with his name and a bunch of whoever the powers that be were in the building on that day. Stan took this sheepskin, had it framed, and hung it in his office, and it shows up in photos of Stan in his office for decades. Also in 1992, I was visiting Stan out in Santa Monica, and I was out there on business, and I dropped into his office for about an hour, and we were reminiscing, and I brought up the trope about the Cliosophic Society, and which he actually used in his patter in interviews for decades. And he says, well, my Cliosophic Society certificate is still hanging there on the wall decades later. So it was, we're wrapping up. The meeting dispersed. We're walking back across campus to get dinner, and walking past the opposite side of Blair Tower as sundown and the lights are coming up, and somehow it just always reminded me of the head of the Dread Dormammu in Doctor Strange comic books, except that the inside of his head is on fire, but the outside of his head is not on fire. So we're walking down that path in order to get to dinner. Now, back up. This one, right. Okay, get rid of all that fumfer. So we just walked with Stan and Joan down to our club, which is sort of an equivalent of frat houses, and in order to take them to dinner there. One or two other Marvelites joined us at that table. And everyone, for a change, actually managed to talk about things that had nothing to do with Marvel. Also one of the great benefits of having Joan along. So this is actually an interesting thing historically, because Stan had this well-worn story that he liked to tell, one of these self-deprecating Stan Lee jokes, which he, again, used for decades. It's actually in his memoirs in Excelsior. Stan tells this story that he went to Bard in 1964, and he didn't know what to expect, so he dressed up in his best suit. And when he got there was a lot of friendly people, but the students all looked like hippies, and he felt he was just a little bit out of place. But then the talk went well. He went off to dinner with some students and professors, but he thought about what to wear when Princeton invited him down, and thought, well, I'm not going to get caught on this thing again, and so I dressed down. I wore jeans, a T-shirt, my oldest sneakers, and then once I got there and the meeting was over, I was invited to dinner at the dean's house. Of course, well, what this is where he really ate dinner. There was no dean, there was no house, and there was no dinner with the dean. He had dinner with us. But it's just another one of those improved stories that Stan just always knew how to make use of a good story. So it turns out that the feedback was that Stan and Joan had a really good time, and Flo got back to us saying what a good time it was. Also, if you have a chance to read some time to read this letter, if anyone who ever met Flo knows, this letter is written exactly the way Flo talked. But they had a great time. So the other important feature resulting from the talk was, but the important impact of the talk, beyond just the good time, was that there was considerable press coverage in New Jersey papers and Philadelphia papers. And again, this is where the trope of Stan as Homer also gets started. Several of the papers picked that up from taking notes. There were several stringers in the audience from the undergraduate press club that supplied articles to other papers. At any rate, this was Stan's proof of concept that it's really worthwhile to accept invitations to colleges. This one essentially jumpstarts his speaking career. He gets Speakers Bureau arrangements, and this is how the whole thing moved on. It took off for Stan, and we're very happy that it did.
So this was a glimpse of the beginning of Stan's college career. My understanding is that Stan then spoke at colleges a great deal for about 10 years. And of course, as the years went on, his speakers went up. I think he actually did not charge for the Princeton appearance, right? You got him for the price of a meal.
Right. We didn't offer any money, and he didn't ask for any.
You know, I think the poor kid from the Bronx who had gone to DeWitt Clinton High School was so thrilled to be invited to Princeton that he might have paid you if you had asked him for a fee to show up. So thank you. I did have a follow. I think our glitchiness. I was hoping you guys would maybe have some questions for each other, but I think that's not gonna fly today. But I did want to ask Scott one quick follow-up. Were there any women at Stan's talk at your college at Virginia Commonwealth?
That's a very good question. I don't recall there being any, to be honest with you. Although I wasn't actually looking around and looking at the rest of the room, my eyes were, laser focused on Stan.
Well, that might answer a question. Because you hear about all these other, like Al Capp was notorious for being really inappropriate with females at colleges that he went to. And you sort of sometimes wonder about Stan, but I think maybe the answer might be there was minimal temptation from female students at Stan's talks because there was minimal female attendance at Stan's talks at colleges. So that question, that might have been a problem that took care of itself if without even ever becoming a problem. Thank you so much for this window into Stan and college and how it affected your life and career. And this was just great and so special. Thank you, Michael Uslan.
Thank you, Danny. This was a lot of fun.
I thank you, Scott Saternye, for both your great photos, for being here. Thank you, Thomas Tolenko, Tim Tulenko, Travis Langley. I do not envy you having to edit this together. And but thank you, gentlemen. Thanks a lot, everybody. You guys stay well and stay healthy, and Excelsior. We'll see you in the funny papers.
Sounds great. Take care of yourself.
Enough said.
Excelsior.
Yeah.